we're launching a new book today, which is Architecture After War, or Architektura після війни in Ukrainian. I'm really grateful for Architectural Foundation for offering this kind of opportunity to participate in their book week. It's really important, especially within the topic that is the book about. So I think I will start to introducing the concept and the structure of the book, and then I'll pass the floor to amazing contributors who are here today, and they will share more about their sort of texts. As we move forward, I would like to introduce our guests. So first, Lynnette Widder is a professor at Columbia University, and she's author of Year Zero to Economic Miracle, Hans Wippert and Sepp Roof in Post-War West, German Building Culture, and co-author of Architecture Life Project, Pedagogy in Practice, and Era Rakitansky as Modern as Tomorrow. Her writing has appeared in publications such as New German Critique, Die Dalos, Bauwelt, and the Social Science Journal. Her current architecture focus is on low embodied energy, low carbon renovations of modernist buildings. And next we have Gruia Badescu, research fellow at the Zukunftskolleg University of Constance, and Gruia's work on cities after political ruptures explores how societies reshape the kind of urban environments in the aftermath of the conflict, shedding light on the intersection between architecture and collective memory. But in terms of actual books, so basically, I mean, I started thinking about some sort of like curated compendium in early spring 2022 when the war in Ukraine was just raging. And that was sort of like a reaction to the full-scale kind of invasion after my father's family home was destroyed by a Russian missile. And at some point, I came up with this kind of idea of curated collection that would cover a broad spectrum of kind of different aspects of war reconstruction, restoration, repair, recovery. And the range of issues is incredibly broad, you know, like including history, commemoration, planning and spatial techniques, strategies, materials, construction methods, regulations within the legal field, and so on, economics, of course, and architectural education as well. And in reality, you know, it's all of these things, they kind of overlap. And I think, you know, we've been trying in the book sort of cover all these aspects, but without any kind of particular advice in the end. So it meant to be more kind of open-ended thing, just a kind of seed of thought that can potentially kind of grow in something different in a particular person kind of example, you know. And, you know, like, for example, as how these things sort of overlap and how they sort of all works together. I mean, in the post-Second World War in France, there was this Ministry of Reconstruction and Urbanism. It was created to sort of streamline the reconstruction efforts, and the ministry sort of oversaw the key initiatives such as the industrialization of traditional construction methods, the standardization of materials like prefabricated stone, and organizing competition to boost kind of local economy and local kind of construction. And these measures help accelerate rebuilding while improving efficiency and kind of reducing waste and so on and so on. And going back to the book, I think as a result, we ended up with this bilingual English-Ukrainian kind of book, which is sort of collection of 10 essays, kind of touching base on different kind of aspects of the post-war reconstruction. Again, sort of trying to cover all this broad kind of field of topics. And like every contribution is about a particular thing. Is it like commemoration, or is it a history, or is it like education, or more practical things such as like building materials and how you deal with these kind of more practical side of repair and reconstruction. And yeah, I think the key idea was to sort of, you know, create this handbook somehow, almost like a handbook, to serve as a resource for those kind of engaged in the complex task of rebuilding societies and cities in the aftermath of the war. And the aim to situate sort of questions of architecture after war within wider, currently expanding kind of understanding of repair, reconstruction, and how building can sort of respond to the unprecedented scale of devastation and destruction currently unfolding across the world, not only in Ukraine, but like in Gaza as well and other places. And in conclusion, I hope this book serves not only as a reflection on the past, but also as a handbook for the future, sort of presenting theoretical and practical exploration of a really urgently timely topic. And yeah, maybe at that point I will pass on to our wonderful contributors. And I think we can start with Lynnette.
Thank you so much, Bohdan, and thank you to the Architecture Foundation for the opportunity to talk about this. I'm so honored and actually touched to have been part of this project and have been in conversation with it. I think, Bohdan, the way you described it as not prescriptive, but really as something that's meant to plant seeds of thought. I think also, when my work has been on the so-called post-war, a terminology that is consensually used for a particular moment in the 20th century, and was struck also by your framing of after war as another way of thinking about it, with, of course, the enormous question of if and when, if and when and where this will actually be possible. So I thought I would go through some images and tie those images into some of the conceptual framework. My focus is post-war West Germany. I'm working on a period before partition, but of course the occupation of Germany by the four post-war allies was determinative of its fate, and those that were occupied by Western European allies had those areas of very different histories. So this is an image from a book that was published and as to sort of publicize work done for a competition for Berlin by the architect Max Taut. Max Taut is a really interesting figure. He was part of the expressionist movement before the war. What makes him so remarkable in the post-war period is that he is one of the very few to draw the city in ruins and to project a new semi-provisional city in front of it. And what you see here is on the left, the famous Kurfürstendamm, which was the primary boulevard of West Berlin. In the back, you see the skeletons of the very badly damaged buildings, and in the front, a sort of new kind of architecture, what he called the Vorgarten, or front yard of the city, these small glass screen-like structures, introducing a kind of levity or flaneur city life. There's a fascinating film called A Day in July, 1945, that is one of the first color film documentaries that shows Berlin at this time. And in fact, as soon as they could, people would dress in whatever brightly colored clothing they had and go back down to Kudamm and just walk around, even though the rest of the city was still devastated. And I think that's something that's reflected here in a really poignant way. Could you turn me the next slide, please?
Sure.
So elsewhere in the city, you see Taut working with this kind of mechanistic or clearly international modernist vocabulary. But if you'd go to the next, please, one of the other points that he made was that the rebuilding of the city or the rethinking of the city, especially a city like Berlin that is surrounded by rivers and flatlands and essentially an agricultural landscape, was an opportunity to bring plants and plant life and sort of shift the culture. This is not the standard modernist light and air. Cities after the war, there is quite a bit of writing about the infiltration, the taking over of cities by plant life. And there's also quite a bit of thought given to the repastoralization of Germany, which had created 2 world wars, and one way in which that was supposed to be prevented into the future was to take away the possibility of industrialization. So there's all kinds of sort of overlapping thoughts and readings that are in Taut's work, both in the drawing of ruins and the drawing of a sort of technological solution, but also in the predominance of plant life and landscape in what he does. Could I have the next, please? So another aspect of what the response was in West Germany in the initial years after the war was a step back or a step away from technological solutions. Germany was one of the earliest nations to industrialize. There is the famous Adorno and Horkheimer reading of the mechanistic aspects of extermination that the Germans had perfected in that war, both as a genocidal tactic and as a warfare tactic. These are small houses by Egon Eiermann, who went on to be a kind of marquee architect of the German post-war, and they're done in raw earth. They're built out of mud, essentially. And there are several examples of this. Otto Bartning, another Southern German architect, built in mud. So the idea that rather than looking to the typical tropes of building, there's a way in which there's a shift in materials, especially at a moment when labor was more available than were technological solutions. Could I have the next? At the same time, the most prevalent material was actually rubble. So you have rubble showing up in different ways. There's a kind of provisionalism that in a way is reflected in the mud building. It's reflected in the so-called Trümmerfrauen, the troops of women and children who would go out and salvage usable bricks to patch buildings. But what you see here is one of many, many patents for reusing rubble as a building material. And in this one, this was a patent for metal shuttering. The rubble would be ground up and used in a slurry, and this was a sliding formwork that was used fairly successfully by an architect, Leonhard, who became an engineer who became quite famous for bridge building after the war. Have the next, please. Finally, I had a really interesting conversation many years ago with Ulrich Konrads, who was a really important editor and critic and journalist in the post-war period, where he talked about the difference between building for the existential and building in the context of the sort of intellectual spiritual. And both church building, which was very important in West Germany as one of the few intact institutions, as well as housing, worked with the same materials, rubble, salvaged material, etc. But what you found in church building was, first of all, the integration of lay people in the thinking through of architecture, which allowed for new kinds of spatial expression, but also the sort of the idea of phasing or ad hoc, where things would first be stabilized, then weatherproofed, and then ultimately built out over time. So this is a church outside of Cologne that was initially put back together, and only over time were things like plaster put onto walls or all of the sanctuary and religious instruments put into place. But the sort of juxtaposition of this large industrial window against the raw brick is sort of exemplary for that, the importance of phasing.
And thank you very much, Bohdan, for the invitation to join the book and for Architecture Foundation for this event. So my piece is called "Before the War Ends: Making Sense of Ruins and Reconstruction," and I wrote that in the first year of the full-scale invasion, when actually we started this project. And I started the essay reminiscing the fact that the day when Russia launched its full-scale invasion, I was in Beirut, a city that I've been researching for many years. And I was there in the aftermath of the explosion, and we can see here an image taken exactly on the day of the full-scale invasion. And I was thinking, and I reflect a bit. So it has this personal, emotional touch at the beginning of this piece, as we're all grappling with emotions, seeing what was happening in Ukraine, but also I was trying to make sense of how do I feel as an Eastern European. I'm originally from Romania, being in Beirut, a place of so much discontent in the last 30 years, the one that actually continues to hit the news the last few weeks. And I was trying to make sense of my own worries, my own anger regarding Russia, in a place where I cannot really speak about it because I felt that people had other worries and other emotions. And it's kind of like in this dialogue between the Middle East and our region, let's say Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans, the place I've been working for many years and understanding how reconstruction has been shaped in the recent wars there. And from this dialogue, I wanted to actually share a few insights in this piece. So can I have a slide, please?
Yeah.
So in this piece, I bring forward a number of points from this engagement with a number of contexts. And of course, the first point is that reconstruction is never something that happens after war. Reconstruction begins during wartime. Reconstruction planning and thinking often begins during a war. For instance, here, this is a UK plan drawn in the early 40s, just after bombs have fallen over British cities. The same happened in Germany. So planners and architects were thinking sometimes quite cynically, as reconstruction was seen as an opportunity to bring forward a new vision for a new city, for the modernist city that the previous urban form did not really permit. So if we can have the next slide, this particular moments of thinking through as the bombs are falling, we can see them in most conflicts. In Sarajevo, during the siege of the city, which took place in 1992 and 1995, already at the beginning, you see architects meeting, often traveling through the city under sniper fire to meet and discuss how to document destruction and how to think the city of the future. The same is, as in the next slide will show, discussions during the long Lebanese civil war, 15 years of frequent fights and then ceasefires and moments of thinking about reconstruction would happen basically every few years. In this case, even an international symposium took place in 1983 to think and bring in actually German and Polish architects that Lynnette has mentioned into thinking how the experience of the Second World War can actually fit this. And what's important here is that the war did not have any horizon to be over. So this is actually, you can see this happening in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, many architects, planners, thinkers are thinking what to make of this, how to use this also as an opportunity for a better city, but in any case, how to recover. And now we're moving to the next slide and the next point. The next point I wanted to make is about the need to engage with the legacy of the past. And I want to start with reflecting back also the German example. In 1967, there was a book written by Alexander von Mitscherlich, who was reflecting back at the frenetic reconstruction of Germany and calling let's say the interest in building back and in also building back the economy as a way to actually forget to deal with the troublesome past. He called the book "The Inability to Mourn," and it's very interesting to look at this parallel and this dialogue between the process of dealing with the past, of actually dealing with victim, with responsibility, with the different political emotions, and the act of reconstruction. That's actually the subject of my forthcoming book, which is on architects and guilt, architects and dealing with the past. But in this case, as we see in this slide, this comes back to haunt different different contexts. In the case of Sarajevo, after 3 years of destruction of the city, which at the end lay 70% in ruins, you had American architect Lebowitz Woods arriving in Sarajevo and proclaiming the need to engage with the past and proposing that basically every building would be rebuilt for about 80% to fit its formal function. In this case, it's the electrical building, the electroprivreda, but a part of it will be dedicated to represent the memory of the car. In this case, a car that becomes a scab. And then he had several projects for the city. But what's very important is to point out that the reaction in the city was one of full rejection. Rejection. Why? Because people, I've been doing the ethnography and interviews with architects and planners involved in these discussions. They were saying they wanted to go back to the way that the city was, or to build a new future, but not to be reminded every day as you leave your house by a traumatic experience of the war. On the other hand, as we see in the next slide, in places like Belgrade, this is an image of one of the key sites destroyed by the NATO bombing of 1999, the General Staff of the Yugoslav Army, in a city where just a few buildings, about 70 buildings were destroyed, and they were all strategic buildings. We can see that in the last decades, there's a desire to keep the ruins, to point to the victimhood of the Serbs under the NATO bomb. So in different contexts, people react differently. Once you have a fully ruined city, there's a desire to move beyond. In other cases, the desire to point to the memory of victimhood is stronger. In other places, as we see in the next slide on Warsaw, we see that the desire to move on is so it can be also expressed through the desire to rebuild the way it was. Warsaw is a very interesting example because we're talking here about the post-war moment in which the idea of rebuilding the same way it was a faux pas in conservation circles. But in this case, Zalvatov is the main conservationist of Warsaw, argued and convinced even the Communist Party that it's very important to build back the way that the city was, in order to show to the entire world that Hitler's desire to annihilate the Polish capital is reversed. While if we see the next slide, this idea of rebuilding, particularly heritage, as in the case of Warsaw, the old town, all went into the last decades of seeing a number of funders focusing on heritage buildings. Like in the case of Mostar that we see here, rebuilding the old bridge, rebuilding heritage buildings, while hospitals, kindergartens, functional buildings remain unbuilt. And you can see the disgruntlement of locals when they see that decisions are taken in their name of what actually is meant to be rebuilt. And this idea of the importance of heritage can also be used in a lucrative way, as we can see the case of Beirut's city's reconstruction in the next slide. While cities like Warsaw went to recover a long lost urban landscape, in others, the idea of the future, the idea of rebuilding modernity was very important. In the case of post-war Germany, we see that the so-called autogerechte Stadt, the car-centered city, became the important paradigm. And this was called by voices in Germany, particularly the leftists, as a second destruction. So reconstruction was seen as a second destruction. Reconstruction was deemed to be violent on its own terms by actually promoting forms of urbanism that were contrary to urban life. The same Mitterlich that I mentioned earlier, talking about the inability to mourn, wrote a book a year after that one about the inhospitality of German cities as a result of decisions taken in Reconstruction. And that I reflect in the piece means also a challenge to think what kind of models that are being discussed now, the smart city, the resilient city. What do they mean actually in the actual reconstruction for Ukrainians? Also, as we see in the next slide, another point is that this violence of reconstruction can also be articulated in what kind of buildings are forgotten or glossed over or rebuilt in a different way. In the case of former Yugoslavia, we see a lot of Yugoslav socialist buildings being rebuilt in completely different styles, erasing the presence of socialist Yugoslavia. And this is a key challenge for, as I discussed, for Ukraine to rethink its Soviet heritage. To what does it mean, as there are many voices now to dispense somehow all these years of Soviet modernism as they're connected with the current trauma associated with Russia. But to what extent is that something that came from the outside or is developed by local voices, and to what extent is modernism just something to be associated with that regime? And the final point that I make in the piece, in the next slide, is actually the importance of the social aspect of the people who are to be housed in this cities that are being rebuilt. On the one hand, you have the question of recovering the sense of place for the people who lived in that particular space, but the other one is actually what to make of the internally displaced people and the refugees. So there's a wonderful work done in the American University of Beirut on how Syrian refugees in Beirut have actually reshaped the city, as in this image. But the question is, Ukraine, destruction, severe destruction in the east and the south, but not only, as actually cities have been targeted everywhere, but also millions of people, not only who fled outside of the country, but who actually moved to other parts of the country. So a challenge of reconstruction is not only for the cities that need to be rebuilt, but also for the cities that will have to somehow deal with a new population that exists. And I wanted to go back to Beirut in my last slide, as this is another image I found right on the day of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The key point actually of the piece is that there's needs to be a dialogue between the social aspect and the spatial aspect of reconstruction. As we can see here, our space is destroyed, but we are not. People show resilience under conflict, after destruction. But even after reconstruction happens, restoration happens, the question is what happens to the populations? To what extent is dealing with this difficult past be put together in dialogue with the issue of reconstruction? So the main argument is actually to confront and think, once you do the plans for reconstruction, to actually think of a socially minded and forward-looking, but also place-sensitive reconstruction. What is that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really really useful and amazing presentation. I was just thinking in terms of the scale of destruction, let's say in Ukraine, when just really big city has been just wiped out into the dust. Let's say, this kind of there's two things basically. One is how you deal with this in terms of kind of memorization of, or kind of how you overcome this trauma in terms of kind of architectural thing, because the city has been destroyed and there's definitely a lack of material presence of history, the shared and the communal history embedded in the buildings and streets has just been wiped out. And obviously after the war and during the reconstruction, how you deal with this lack of historical background, how you exactly these questions, how you sort of how you deal with these scars. Do you want them to be present, or do you want to forget them? How this is a really kind of crucial question. But as well, I was just sort of linking this to this kind of mud building blocks and things, and just thinking, is it something that can be potentially kind of overcome through using kind of local materials, maybe, just kind of maintaining local kind of ways of construction or something, when, I just, I think there's so many links in between these things and how they can kind of, influence each other. And
Yeah, I mean, it's always such a, and I'm sure we're all aware of this, it's always such a difficult and delicate topic to think about the idea of how to commemorate or what comprises collective memory and the role that architecture plays in it. It's always striking to me that as much as architects would wish for their work to contribute in a positive way, I mean, I'm sure there are architects whose idea of what positive is may be different from mine. I'm, thinking ahead to what I believe will be the fallout of the upcoming US election, which bodes ill for many things. But as much as architects might wish to make work that creates the sort of spatial and material conditions for better political, better social, better intellectual aspirations, it's almost always the way those spaces are used and perceived that determines it. Certainly questions of, the architects of post-war Germany were not unified in how they thought about that. Traut, for one, was in favor of leaving major monuments in complete ruin and letting their future dissipation be a reminder. I mean, certainly the German population was in a very different state because there was consensus that to think of themselves as victims was completely impossible. But still, the idea of commemorization at the same time that you're trying to build a new country that is a better or has higher aspirations, really difficult. And whether it means rebuilding in an older scheme, whether it means rethinking, rejecting, certainly in the rejection of the past and the embrace of a kind of international or luxury standard. There are all different permutations. And I honestly, although I think it's important and helpful for architects to think about it, I think that there's a political process that needs to happen, both bottom up and top down and somewhere in the middle. And it's up to architects to participate in that rather than to anticipate it or dictate to it. So, and I think you saw again in post-war West Germany a whole range of things. There were debates in Frankfurt about the rebuilding of the Goethe House, and the Goethe House was rebuilt using historical methods. Versus other places where history was seen as a burden. Not only, certainly the autogerechte Stadt, the idea that the opportunities for making, more efficient cities, but also the idea that history was nothing to be proud of. So, there's a lot to dig into there. As far as earth building goes, these were really, it's amazing that how forgotten these are. A lot of it was built for and by refugees for themselves. And the fact that these were locally available materials in an instance where you had an oversupply of labor and, both skilled and unskilled labor, made also, back to this question of what the social context is, made for a very different kind of social encounter and social space around these buildings that otherwise might have been perceived as being poor. So,
yeah.
Just to follow up on this, the context, as I mentioned, is very important. And so in every political constellation, in every historical situation, you'll have different logics of keeping ruins, as I gave the example of Sarajevo and Belgrade, of rebuilding the same as before or not. And actually, in my broader work, I look at the intentionality of architects. I try to understand that in context of Germany, Poland, from Yugoslavia and Lebanon. So very different contexts in different constellations of actors of questions. And architects do not think, at least in what I find, do not think that much of the question of the past. And I'm trying to highlight the voices of those who thought of responsibility, of political responsibility. But what the main argument is that no matter if they thought or not, what they build had an impact on how societies process the past. The moment when lucrative reconstructions reshape this let's say the socialist modernist heritage of Sarajevo, Belgrade, etc., Yugoslavia is gone from urban space. So sometimes intentionality doesn't doesn't matter. What matters is the consequence. So even banal decisions that are very much circumvented into political economy or into other actors, into funding scheme, into they can go into either erasure of certain things, a complete destructuring of the sense of place of communities. So, but we have to always think critically avant le fait, so before the fact itself. What is the possible consequence? So maybe this is a question for ethics of architecture.
Yeah, I do agree that you know, the whole thing about the reconstruction, obviously it's that, I mean, we're talking about particularly architecture, but in general, if we look at this, it's a way more kind of broader phenomenon, isn't it? Like, it's just it needs to like, all the society needs to be involved in this, and all these things that sort of interact and affect each other, you know, like political decisions or like deregulations in the building field, whatever, that sort of all kind of affects the final outcome, you know, what will be done in the architectural kind of way and in the architectural field. So that's actually, yeah, maybe an interesting kind of finalizing note, you know, saying that it's not really about a design. It's obviously about a design as well, but in general, I think it's just something that goes way beyond to the actual society and the vision of society, how it will be shaped and how society sort of see its sort of future, and you know, and architects just as a part, like a small part of this broader reconstruction or recovery after the war and destruction.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate. I hope that we can, if there's anything to learn from the German post-war, I would say that the architects who were most influential started out from a position of contrition and modesty, which are not two characteristics for which Germany was known, but they're the ones that make that period so humbling for me. And to quote my Syrian friend who I mention in my chapter, I hope that sooner rather than later, there are many, many more people who understand and can live in what they might be considered after war. So thank you for giving those words.
Thank you all for writing, and thank you for participating in this event. I think it really kind of widens up a bit and gives a bit more of understanding of the actual, your contributions, but also kind of gives a really good understanding of the actual book. So thank you all for joining. That was really, really great.